In his text, Naturalis Historia, the 1st century Roman historian Pliny the Elder narrated a great anecdote about the ancient Greek artists Zeuxis and Parrhasius. He talks about a great Greek event enacted in the 4th century where the two candidates were brought together to determine the greatest painter of their time. Zeuxis presented his work first. He had painted some grapes, but these were no ordinary grapes. They were so realistically drawn that birds flocked down to eat them. Surely he couldn't be outmatched. Then everyone headed over to Parrhasius' studio, where Zeuxis anxiously positioned himself before the curtain, ready for his rival's painting to be unveiled. Eventually, he stepped up and tried to draw the curtain aside, only to find out that it was the painting. Zeuxis conceded defeat and remarked, "I have deceived the birds, but Parrhasius has deceived Zeuxis." There is another story about birds flocking to one of Zeuxis' paintings, in which a boy was holding up some grapes. Zeuxis was quite annoyed at the prospect and considered the work a failure. He thought that if the boy was painted with more skill, he'd have scared the birds away. And now that we're on a roller coaster of anecdotes, here's another tidbit. Zeuxis died while laughing at a painting of an old woman he'd just drawn. Ancient Greece has left a very strong mark on Western and global history. Institutions like democracy and disciplines like philosophy were notably influential. But there's one part of the Hellenic tradition that is often overlooked: art. The Greeks were quite obsessed with ideas of harmony, balance, proportion, and the ideal form, and this came through in their art. One of the key origins of the Renaissance was a revival of interest in the classical antiquity. The young Italian artists couldn't help but fall in love with the humanist values of yore, all represented in the mathematical proportions of Hellenic art. However, many of those cherished artworks have been lost to time. After all, we are talking about some 22-odd centuries here. But this doesn't mean that we don't know anything about ancient Greek art. The Greeks drew in highly naturalistic forms, which was unusual. Egyptian art, for instance, only drew in 2 dimensions and did not attempt to fake a third. This inclination was a result of the Greek search for ideal proportions. When they painted human beings, they drew the bodies as if they were the bodies of gods, not men. Male nudes were quite common and often were just a bit too perfect. But characters were not the only thing in an artwork. There was also everything else around it. The environment had to be portrayed ideally, in other words, how the human eye perceived it. However, these characteristics appeared over time in prosperous societies and incorporated major influences from the Near East. They were not adopted overnight. In fact, if one were to compare something made during the era of Socrates and Plato to ancient Greek Neolithic art, the two objects would be worlds apart. So, let's discuss the 4 periods of ancient Greek art and how they changed and developed over time. It is important to note that these are not strict movements per se, but broad categories based on the general trends of different eras. The geometric period. We start with the Bronze Age, as one often does. After the Bronze Age collapse, there is a stretch of time known as the Greek Dark Ages. Little to no literary or archaeological evidence from this epoch exists anymore. Obviously, the Mediterranean region was still reeling from the collapse, but the Dark Ages were not that dark. The major thing to take away here is that when the Mycenaean civilization fell, so did their writing system. And that explains the lack of historical records. The years from 1050 to 900 BCE are often referred to as the proto-geometric period of ancient Greek art. This bleeds into the geometric period, in which we witness the re-emergence of ceramic painting. Pottery from 900 to 700 BCE was painted in dark colors against a light tone and represented animals and humans. But the main takeaway here is the presence of decorative shapes and patterns. This is some very neat iconography, quite geometrically harmonized, which give the era its fairly pedestrian name. The main feature of this era is the horror vacui, or the fear of empty space, because no place on these utensils is left untouched. Despite their busyness, the figures and decorations are still very cleanly organized into several layers. The vases and vessels you see here were mainly used for two purposes: 1. Social and religious rites, and 2. Grave markers. A vessel at a drinking party down at the symposium would probably show a ton of men making merry, whereas vessels for funerary rites carried ashes and were marked with grieving scenes. Ceramics were the dominant medium of the time, but the later geometric era art also showed a tendency for sculpture. The Archaic period. The Archaic period is still, as the name implies, quite archaic, going from 700 to 480 BCE. This was a time when the Mediterranean region developed trade and diplomacy on a wider scale. This means that the Greeks had access to art from other areas, most notably the Near East. Artworks found in the period between 735 and 650 BCE show a distinct development of new styles and characteristics. These trends did not develop in an airtight space. They were borrowed from Eastern cultures during what is known as the Orientalizing phase. The increased trade led to the discovery of new materials and tools, which in turn led to technological advancements. Trade also brought prosperity to the region, and now people had more time on their hands. 1. To drink, so that now there were a lot of vessels of various shapes and sizes, and 2. To take interest in beauty and art, so that they were all well decorated. The later geometric period and then the Archaic period also sometimes show a very focused interest in epic scenes from wars and mythology. We know that the ancient Greeks were very fond of their oral tradition in engaged poetic recitations during social events. Plato has a funny story that when Homer started writing his poetry, people laughed at him because it was such a weird concept for them. We also see the ancient Greeks starting to learn the representation of humans in a far more realistic manner during the Archaic period. The toy-like paper-thin figurines were replaced with highly detailed characters wearing unique clothes and accessories. And there was no absolute rule set. Some craftsmen created pottery art that showed detailed figures in black paint against a light tone, while others painted red figures containing only black outlines that allowed the pot's natural lighter tones to shine through. One important reason for this increased interest in drawing lifelike human forms was the advent of sculpture. Blocky stone sculptures known as Kuoroi started popping up. And it might come as a surprise, but male figures were more idealized in terms of their physique and nubile appearance. The statues often had one step slightly in front of the other, which had been the case in Egyptian sculpture for centuries. So it's not hard to assume that the Greeks learned a thing or two from their southern neighbors. However, the Greeks took their art further than the Egyptians ever did, and over the years, taking an increasingly three-dimensional approach. The Classical period. Classical Greece. You know how people on the internet is convinced that people think about Roman Empire quite often? Well, I, for one, think about classical Greece, its beautiful art, literature, and, of course, civil wars. The classical period is regarded as the time between 480 to 323 BCE. Although much shorter than the other two, it was far more influential than both of them combined. So what transpired during this period? Well, we have the invention of democracy in Athens, the Greco-Persian conflicts, and finally the rise of Alexander, the Macedonian conqueror. But most importantly, this era featured the rise of philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. This was a time in history when Athens was a great center of literature, civilization, intellect, art, and culture. The Persian Wars were over, and in 450 BCE, the Athenian general Pericles had to find a new way to covet the support of the people, build temples, public monuments, and great structures. He built the Parthenon on top of the Acropolis in the honor of Athena. Constructed with marble and exquisitely decorated with sculpture on all sides, it would have looked glorious in its heyday. But it was not the only great monument to be built. Massive temples were erected at Corinth, Delphi, and Olympia as well. 3 architectural styles gained prominence during this period: the Doric order, the Ionic order, and the Corinthian order. The other great aspect of the classical age was sculpture. Phidias, the famed sculptor who built the statue of Athena in the Parthenon, also built the statue of Zeus at the temple in Olympia, which made it into several lists of the 7 ancient wonders. Sculpture moved on from tight, symmetrical forms and started to express flowing, dynamic spaces. Artists were now capturing men in action, as if Medusa had suddenly laid eyes on him, turning him into stone. Physical idealism was still very much a thing, and it had no better manifestation than movement and change. Since their idealized male form was highly muscular, curvature became a key element. Once again, male nudes were most sought after, but Praxiteles' Aphrodite of Knidos was highly popular and set the standard for female nudes for centuries. The classical period remains a high point of Greece to this day, but it was during the Hellenistic era that their influence spread across the world. The Hellenistic period. After having conquered half the world, Alexander the Great died in 323 BCE. Thus began the Hellenistic period that would end in 23 BCE. Parts of Europe, Africa, and Asia had been subjugated by the Macedonian forces, but it all came crashing down rather quickly. Alexander's kingdom was divided among his generals. The Greek influence had spread across the world, and their concepts were adopted and fused into local cultures all over the globe. But let's start with Greece itself. Sculpture again was a highlight, but it wasn't bound by the same need to find the ideal human form. Expression became far more important, and new artists wanted to tackle heavy themes. Instead of the perfect male body, now they were quite happy to introspect about death and old age. This, of course, also went the other way, with some artists taking the more flamboyant route. Just one look at Laocoon and his sons demonstrates the point. It almost seems like a Baroque statue. But why did all these changes occur at this point in time? Well, the wealth accrued by the Macedonians went toward the pursuit of beauty. With the increase in the public's buying power, artistic commissions increased tenfold. High culture was no longer restricted to high classes. Now let's move out of Greece. After the Romans went on their murderous spree, they decided to adopt any and everything that the Greeks had mastered. They not only took their intellectual values and their architecture, but they even took their gods. In Egypt, the Ptolemaic dynasty fused Greek traditions with Egyptian culture, culminating into a unique blend. Heading east, we see Parthian art adopting Greek ideas into their Persian fold. The Bactrians did the same in Central Asia, and so did the Gandhara civilization in South Asia. The ancient Greek influence on reason, logic, and central tenets of modern life is known to all and sundry. It's about time their artistic contributions are appreciated in a similar manner. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and comment. Subscribe to the channel for more juicy historical content. Bye for now. See you in the next one.